Hello. Thank you for tuning into this talk, which I'm recording for Leeds LGBT Literary Festival. My name is Rowan Fruin. My pronouns are they, them, and I am an illustrator and comic artist. And I'm also a researcher. And my work largely focuses on queer history. I create work that celebrates queer authors from history, and I also create comics that explore my own experiences as a non-binary trans person. And today I am just going to talk a little bit about a zine I released at the beginning of the year, A Potted Trans History. As you can see, my hair has grown since then. And yeah, tell you a little bit about the background of it, the process, and a little bit about the content. It is a 12-page zine. It is fully illustrated. It's risograph printed, and it essentially traces the history of transness and kind of people who we would recognize in sharing relationships to gender that correspond with our current ideas of transness, and tracing that from classical antiquity all the way up to the Stonewall riots. It started as a illustrated PowerPoint presentation that I gave for a project I'm working on with Comics Youth. I gave it to a group of fellow trans people who I'm working with just to tell them what I knew about trans history, and it was received really positively, and a lot of the feedback was that they hadn't heard a lot of this before despite being interested in it. So I decided then to make it into a zine so that I could share more widely what I know about trans history in a way that feels quite visual and accessible. I think often conversations about queer history, and more specifically trans history, only really take place in academic echo chambers, and it can feel like some of the information that comes out of it and the conversations don't really trickle down to the people who might actually find it useful. So it was really important to me to create something non-academic that we can see ourselves in, that just shares this information, and that is accessible and not too long as well. Especially with the current climate and with all that's going on for trans folks, particularly in the UK, but also increasingly in the US as well. It's quite a scary time to be trans, and so focusing on trans history rather than the present can feel, or the future, can feel a bit irrelevant or frivolous, and I recognise that my ability to focus on trans history comes from a place of privilege that allows me to do this. But I do think the topic is relevant and is important and can help in its own way. I think one of the first reasons is because a lot of transphobic rhetoric focuses on the argument that transness is new or a trend, and this just isn't the case. Although the labels that we have are new labels, people have related to gender in the way that we understand as trans for a long time, and I think by demonstrating that we've always been here, we can start to deconstruct this argument. I think another reason is because it's really nice to see yourself in history, and I think being able to see ourselves throughout history as trans people is just something that's quite nice and affirming. I personally have found researching this and finding people throughout history who didn't have the labels trans or non-binary describe their relationship with gender in a way that really resonates with me. Super affirming. And yeah, I hope that people are able to find that through reading about trans history in my work. And I think the other really important thing is that thinking about trans history in kind of a broader way helps us to understand how our current understanding of gender and the concept of binary gender especially is new and is really rooted in transmedicalism as well as in colonialism. And I think acknowledging that's really important. These are not like the concept of kind of scientific sex as kind of immutable and true is a really new concept, and also it's important to recognize that there have always been cultures as well that do not focus on a binary gender, who have different structures for understanding gender, and Western colonialism did a lot to enforce binary gender. And so these are important things to think about when we think about the conversations about transness and gender now as well. And the other reason that I wanted to do this is because there's an increasing amount of work that focuses on queer history, especially academic, but like increasingly we're seeing great work on kind of that trickles down in a more accessible way, thinking about queer history and the history of sexuality, but there's still relatively little on trans history. And what little there is on trans history tends to focus on quite a narrow window. It tends to be recent history, focused on the 20th century. It often kind of focuses on figures who have transitioned. And I think it's important that we start to widen and look further back about trans history, and that it's not something that just appeared when sexology took place. Like, these ways that people have related to gender have always existed. It's just the language that we've had has changed. So I think it's important to discuss why there's not very much work on trans history. I mean, obviously one of the reasons is transphobia, and people are still reluctant to acknowledge that transness is an actual thing. However, I think it also has more finicky reasons, especially when it comes to academia, and lots of that comes down to arguments about language and how we use language to talk about historical figures. So one of the main sticking points when it comes to talking about trans history is using the terms transgender and non-binary to talk about figures in the past. People feel really strongly that we shouldn't use anachronistic modern terms and labels and assign them to historical figures. And I agree with this in theory. I very strongly believe we can't just pluck a historical figure and say definitively this person was trans or this person was non-binary, because they didn't have that language. However, I think not using these terms at all to discuss figures from the past is kind of really narrowing the conversations we can have. And I think for me, what we should be doing when we talk about trans history is looking at figures from the past and saying, these figures, if they had access to the language we have now, they might have related to our ideas of trans and non-binary. And that's what I'm doing throughout the zine and throughout this talk. I'm not saying this figure definitively was trans. I'm saying that the way they related to gender strongly echoes the way that we think about transness now. I think that we should be able to talk about transness in the same umbrella way we use queer now. So we are quite comfortable talking about queer history, and I think it's important to note that when we talk about queer history, we do use anachronistic language, and we are more comfortable doing that to talk about sexuality than we are to talk about gender identity. So, for example, people are largely comfortable saying, for example, Anne Lister was a lesbian, or Shakespeare was bisexual. When they wouldn't have had access to that language themselves, we are extrapolating that information based on what we know about them and their writings. And I think we should be able to use trans in that same umbrella way and say, you know, although they didn't use that term, the way they spoke, the way they talked about gender relates strongly to our modern concept. And I think it's also important to note that this argument about using anachronistic labels kind of sometimes feels disingenuous, because we are comfortable talking about more modern figures. So if you think about Lily Elba, or Sylvia Rivera, or Marsha P. Johnson, we are very comfortable saying that these figures were transgender, but they also would not have used those terms for themselves. Transgender and non-binary are very recent labels relatively, and if you look at the 20th century, even the late 20th century, the labels that people were using to describe their relationship to gender were different. There is a wide array, and I think we should be able to acknowledge that. I thought that I would just talk to you a bit about a couple of figures that I included in the zine, who I think are really interesting and I think illustrate what I'm trying to do when I talk about trans history. Yeah, I hope you enjoy. Before I dig into that, I will just note a little bit about the pronouns and language I'm using. So for figures, I generally base what pronouns I use based on the way they describe themselves in their own writing if I can, or in accounts of them. If I'm unsure, I generally take the lead from other people who have written about these figures. For the first figure I'm talking about, I use she, her pronouns. For the second figure, I use she, they pronouns. And with the first figure, I quote from a document a lot, which uses he, him pronouns. So if I'm using he, him pronouns, I'm quoting, otherwise I use she, her pronouns. So, firstly I want to talk about Eleanor Reichner. So Eleanor Reichner was a 14th century medieval sex worker, and we know about her from a single document. We don't have any other information, any other documentation about her. It's from a court transcript from the London plea and memoranda rolls. She was tried for sodomy, for being found having sex with a man while wearing women's clothing. And I think the document is just incredibly enlightening, and it also allows us to think about how we are choosing to interpret history, which I think is really important when thinking about queer history and trans history, because a lot of these gaps in these conversations come from choosing not to think about certain things. So in this document, the transcript describes how John Britby of the County of York and Reichner, calling himself Eleanor, having been detected in women's clothing, who were found last Sunday night between the hours of 8 and 9 by certain officials of the city, lying by a certain stall in Sofas Lane, committed that detestable and unmentionable and ignominious vice. So, writing about Reichner generally frames her presentation as a woman as tied to her sex work. So she's generally described as a gay man who cross-dresses for the purpose of sex work. The term transvestite is generally used when describing Reichner, but I think this document is really rich, and I think by looking at it, I feel like this isn't an accurate description of Eleanor. So it notes that Reichner was brought here in women's clothing and calling himself Eleanor, demonstrating that Reichner wasn't only presenting as a woman in the context of sex work. She came to court presenting as a woman. She told them, "My name is Eleanor." And as well as this, the document also gives us insight into her life outside of sex work. So Reichner further confessed that for 5 weeks before the Feast of St. Michael's last, he was staying at Oxford, and there, in women's clothing and calling himself Eleanor, worked as an embroideress. And also dwelt with a certain John Clerk at the Swan in the capacity of tapster for the next 6 weeks. So embroideress and tapster or barmaid were both jobs almost exclusively held by women in the medieval period. So, and it does tell us that she was presenting as a woman during this time. So this seems to suggest that she was presenting as a woman all the time in her everyday life, as well as in her sex work. And I think it's also interesting to note that throughout the document we're told that Eleanor is having sex with both men and women, both in the context of sex work and outside of sex work. And despite this, we're told that Eleanor is a cross-dressing gay man. So why are we comfortable labelling Eleanor a gay man, which again is using language which wouldn't have been accessible to Eleanor, and also contradicts the little evidence we have about Eleanor? She was sleeping with both men and women, but are not comfortable labelling someone who presented as a woman in her life, worked women's jobs, came to court and told them, "My name is Eleanor," as a trans woman. And I think, to me, this document really suggests that if she had our current language, Eleanor likely would have identified as a trans woman. So for my other example, I'm going to skip forward to the 20th century, which I know I complained about earlier, and that all of the accounts are focused on the 20th century, but I promise in the zine there are several figures between Eleanor and this figure. But I just think that this is a really interesting example, and an example you might be more familiar with. So I'm going to talk about Radclyffe Hall. So Hall is famous for her novel The Well of Loneliness, which remains one of the most well-known lesbian novels, and was also famously banned for obscenity. And Hall is also an incredibly significant figure in lesbian history, both in just lesbian literary history and history in general, and I would argue is also an important figure in trans history. It's really important to note that one of the areas where there's most tension when thinking about the history of transness is when it comes to figures who hold important spaces in lesbian history. I think people feel like by talking about possibilities of transness for these figures, trans masculinity, that you are erasing lesbian identity, that you are erasing gender non-conforming women, and I feel strongly that this is not the case. I don't think the two have to be mutually exclusive when thinking about history. I think a figure can be really important lesbian figure and also really important when we think about trans history. And I think discussing transness and relationship with these figures does not in any way take away from their important as historically important lesbian figures. And I would also not want to do that either. I think as queer people, we often don't have many examples of ourselves in history, and those figures who have contributed to important moments or pieces of work in lesbian history are really important to acknowledge their role in lesbian history. But I think by refusing to allow kind of speculative thinking and conversations about transness in relationship to these figures, we're really closing ourselves off to how we can think about them. So returning to Hall, she identified as a sexual invert, and this is a term that comes from the field of sexology, which is kind of the late 19th, early 20th century study of sexuality and gender. And it was a concept that asserted that people could be born with the traits of the opposite gender, which sounds a lot like transness. However, crucially, this concept was actually used as a way of understanding homosexuality. So it was a theory that asserted that homosexuality was a result of individuals who were born internally being the opposite gender. So for example, with Hall as an invert would be perceived as someone who was internally a man. And so both Hall identified as a sexual invert, and also the central character, Stephen Gordon, of The Well of Loneliness. And actually Hall made this concept known outside of sexology. Like, until The Well of Loneliness, the wider public, were not very aware of this concept, and Hall helped bring it to the fore. So my reasoning for thinking that Hall is an important trans figure doesn't lie just in their identification as an invert, but also just the actions she takes in her life. So they took on the quite neutral name Radcliffe, which is not their birth name. They also, in private, were known by their lover as John. And also they are known for presenting in a really masculine way. So I think there's a lot of ways we can think about Hall, and think if Radcliffe had the language of kind of transmasculinity or non-binary, it's possible that she would have related to that. So yes, I think Hall is just a really interesting figure in the way that she takes the language of sexology and makes it their own in order to discuss the way that they related to sexuality and gender. And I think there's a lot of figures who are like this in the 20th century who are really interesting. We have Gluck, who famously wrote on the back of paintings, no prefix, suffix, or quotes. We have Claude Cahun, who said feminine, masculine, it depends on the circumstance. The only gender that always feels right is neuter. I'm sorry, that's very paraphrased and translated from the French, so I might have got it a bit wrong, sorry, but that's the gist of it. And so people were creating their own language to talk about how they related to gender. I'm going to leave it here for now. In the absence of being able to do a live Q&A, please do feel free over the period of Leeds LGBT Literary Fest to contact me via Twitter, either tweet or DM me. I would love to hear from you. Any questions, thoughts, conversations. It'd be really nice to chat with you. On Twitter, I am at Roanosaur. I'm also on Instagram as Rowan Fruin, and on Etsy as Rowan Fruin Art. You can also find my zine there on my Etsy, and is also sold by a number of it's a little cat paw a number of independent bookshops, including the Bookish Type in Leeds. So please give them your business. They are lovely and I love them. So yeah, thank you so much for tuning in. Hope you found the content of my talk interesting. Thank you Leeds LGBT Literature Festival for hosting this talk, and yeah, thank you for listening. Take care everyone, enjoy the rest of the festival, and I hope to hear from you online. Take care.